So again, I'm Bob Trug from the Center for Bioethics at the medical school, and we'll have a panel here on behavioral economics and the doctor-patient relationship. You've got extensive bibliographies in your packet, so I'll make these brief. Our first speaker will be Jennifer Zamzow, a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ethics and Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Great. Jennifer.
Thank you. So imagine a patient who... So imagine a patient recently suffered an accident and he's now paralyzed. And he requests that all life-sustaining treatment be withdrawn because he imagines that his life as a paraplegic would just be miserable. He thinks it would be a fate worse than death. So many would argue that so long as the patient is competent, we should respect his decision. But what if it's the case that the patient is mistaken about his beliefs about how his life would be as a paraplegic? So what if he's mistaken in thinking that it would be a fate worse than death? What if, in fact, he would adapt to his condition over time and eventually feel that he had a good quality of life, as many patients who become paralyzed end up feeling? So while we don't want to force life-sustaining treatment on patients who actually would rather die than live in their condition, it's also important that we don't withhold life-sustaining treatment or other kinds of treatments for patients due to mistaken beliefs about what life would be like in a particular condition. So in order to make good medical decisions, it's important that patients have accurate, effective forecasts, predictions of how outcomes and how different conditions will actually impact their future feelings and their experiential quality of life. So this raises a really important question for medical ethics. Namely, do physicians have any ethical obligations to help their patients make more accurate, effective forecasts? So it might seem that judgments about how the patient is likely to feel in the future under different conditions are strictly the patient's responsibility. So the physician is responsible for providing the medical information, but patients are supposed to be the experts on their own beliefs, their own values, their own experiences and feelings. So we might think physicians have obligations to inform patients about things like the likelihood of becoming paralyzed from a certain procedure. But we might think physicians don't have an obligation to inform their patients about how they would feel about being paralyzed. So you might think physicians are responsible for the stuff on the left, but patients are responsible for the stuff on the right, thinking about how they will feel about different conditions. So the problem with this is that people tend to be very poor predictors of their own future feelings. So we tend to focus too narrowly on things that will change as a result of a particular event, and not enough on things that will remain the same. We tend to underestimate the power of our psychological immune systems. We underestimate our ability to adapt to different conditions. A phenomena which have all been well studied in economics and in psychology. And so this suggests that merely having privileged access to your own beliefs, your own desires and values, etc., is not actually sufficient for being able to make good predictions about how you'll feel in the future. But there are ways that we can help direct patients' attention to the power of their psychological immune system, their ability to adapt, and so on, that might help them make more effective forecasts. So it seems that patients could actually benefit from having assistance with their effective forecasting. But this by itself isn't enough to show that physicians have an obligation to help them with it. Just because patients could benefit from assistance doesn't by itself show that physicians have this obligation to provide it to them. So why would physicians have an obligation to help their patients with their effective forecasting? Well, I think if we look more closely at the duty of beneficence and what this entails, I think we can get an obligation to help their patients with effective forecasting out of this, because the duty of beneficence involves this obligation to try to help their patients engage in good deliberation and make good decisions when the physician is in a good position to do so qua physician, so given their role as physician. So while physicians might not be in a good position to help their patients with things like their finances, they are in a good position to help their patients with their effective forecasting. So physicians have access to information that patients don't have easy access to about the kinds of things that will affect how they'll feel in the future, and about the kinds of things that tend to impact other patients. So physicians, given their interaction with other patients in similar circumstances, have a better idea of how people tend to respond to different conditions and to different treatments. So physicians can also offer a different perspective. So most notably, physicians are in a different affective state than patients. So if a patient is in a temporary state of severe pain or depression or anxiety about their important medical decision that they have to make, it might be difficult for them to think about how they would actually feel differently in the future. And physicians having a different point of view on the situation can help patients by providing a different perspective. So third, it's more efficient to train physicians in the psychology of medical decision-making than to expect each patient to go out and obtain this information on their own. So information about effective forecasting and effective forecasting biases is specialized information. So it's not something that patients can obtain simply by reflecting on their own beliefs and their own values. So this has obvious implications for medical training. And more empirical research needs to be done to determine exactly what the most effective methods for assisting patients with their effective forecasting are. But I think we can begin to make some headway on the issue by considering some of the questions that are important to think about when we're thinking about designing such an intervention. So one of the first issues that we should consider is what the extent of physicians' obligations are. So before deciding to add something to the already full plate of physicians, we need to think about whether they actually need to undertake this obligation, or whether there are others who can provide this assistance for patients instead. So I want to argue that we might be able to outsource some of this assistance to psychologists or other medical professionals, but physicians still need to play some sort of direct role in the process. So first, it's likely that we'll get more information by having physicians have a direct conversation with their patients. So if patients are more trusting of their physicians than of some stranger, then they're more likely to open up about their beliefs, their fears, their anxieties. And being able to interact directly with the patients will give the physicians more information than if they would just hear about this conversation from a third party. Being able to actually directly participate in this conversation will give them a better understanding of what the patient is thinking, how they're feeling, why they're developing the preferences that they do. So second, it should also increase both parties' engagement in the shared decision-making process by having it be a direct conversation between the physician and the patient, which should improve shared decision-making and also benefit the patient-physician relationship. So another important question is, for what kinds of medical decisions physicians should intervene to assist their patients with? So I think there are at least two situations where it would be important to intervene. One is cases where the patient's effective forecast really matters. So these are going to be cases where the outcomes are likely to have a significant impact on the patient's experiential quality of life, and especially cases where the outcomes of different treatments are likely to be very different. The second kind of situation where it's going to be important to intervene is in cases where patients are particularly likely to make questionable effective forecasts. So these are cases where patients have a poor understanding of what it's like to have certain conditions, or how these conditions might affect their lives. So a patient who has never experienced incontinence before might have very little idea of what that's actually like and how that will actually impact their life. So another question we need to consider is, at what point in the process physicians should intervene? So I want to argue that physicians should not only intervene in cases where patients have made a questionable effective forecast, but also in the initial deliberation. So it can be really difficult to determine whether a particular patient in making a particular decision is actually making a forecasting error. So one problem is that the information about effective forecasting biases is based on base rates. So we can know, in general, people tend to overestimate the impact of different events on how they'll feel and on their experiential quality of life. But it's hard to say of a particular patient in a particular situation that they're actually doing so, or whether there's something about the individual or something about their situation that actually is different. So physicians are likely to miss out on a lot of errors if they're only going to intervene when they suspect that the patient is actually making an error. So lastly, we need to think about how we should integrate the information about effective forecasts with the other information that is relevant for making the decision. So it's important for patients to think about how they will actually feel in various conditions, given various treatments. But it's also important to consider how likely these outcomes are, how costly they are, all the other factors that are involved. So whatever methods of intervention we end up using, the intervention should be a guide and not a shove. So the aim is not to push patients towards particular choices, but to help patients form more accurate beliefs about what life might be like for them under different conditions. And in this way, physicians can help patients make better decisions, make decisions that better accord with their own values and their own preferences for how their life goes, without actually constraining their choice set. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. All right, our next speaker is Professor Alex Capron, University Professor, Scott H. Bice Chair in Healthcare Law, Policy, and Ethics, Professor of Law and Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine, and co-director of the Pacific Center for Health Policy and Ethics at the USC Gould School of Law. Professor Capron. It's very nice. I want to show you something.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to Glenn and Holly and the Petrie-Flom crew. It's a pleasure to be here. These conferences get better every year. The paper I'm presenting is on behalf of myself and Donna Sprout-Metz. This outline is somewhat deceiving because I'm going to skip over the first part in the interest of time and can come back to it later. The bottom line of the first 10 pages or so of the paper is that it's important in all of these areas, not just the public health area, to always ensure that we have a clear purpose, a legitimate purpose reflective of either the welfare interests of society or the individuals who are being affected by the population health intervention, or both, that the authority extends and that it be visible, that the publicity principle that Thaler and Sunstein write about is fulfilled. And I have an interesting example. I invite you to look at the paper, and I have slides about it that will be on the website, but I don't think we'll have time for it. So I want to go on to clinical nudging. The question for a lot of these clinical discussions is whether bioethics, which has spent the last 5 decades fighting physicians' paternalism, the sense that in the Hippocratic terms, the doctor's obligation is to do what is in the best interest of the patient, and the doctor is the judge of what's in the patient's best interest, and tried to substitute for that some sense of shared decision-making and conversation. In the paper, I rely fairly heavily on the work of my former colleague, Jay Katz, in this regard. And I set up 2 hypothetical physicians. Dr. Hippocrates believes that it makes no sense to defer to patients choosing for their own reasons, because he's convinced by the behavioral economics literature that patients don't know their own reasons in any stable and reliable way. And therefore, it is best for the physician to figure out what's right and then to steer the patient through whatever methods will most effectively shape the choices the patient has to make. And we contrast that with Dr. Diligent, who recognizes the problems for the patient and notices that particularly, actually, when we're talking about a lot of healthcare decisions, we're talking about the decisions that are even more freighted and likely to have cognitive problems than other areas, choosing an insurance plan, a retirement plan, or something like that. And so it becomes part of the physician's obligation then to identify the goals with the patient using additional information, and then maybe use rational persuasion, putting information before the patient, but perhaps also using some behavioral economics to shape the choices. So what problems is Dr. Hippocrates going to face? Well, we're talking about a human-to-human relationship, and there's every reason to think that physicians are just as subject to all the cognitive dysfunctions that lie behind the discussion of behavioral economics as are patients. They're different ones, but they are very present, and the writings of people like Jerome Groupman are full of stories of doctors making exactly the kinds of mistakes that arise because of availability or various heuristics. Our healthcare system also makes it difficult for physicians to know their patients very well and therefore have a sense on an individualized rather than a generalized basis what is in the best interest of a patient with a particular condition. And part of this is the lamentable lack of training physicians still receive, and I've been educating doctors for 40 years in some very small way, and there's a lot more attention to this, but there is nowhere near as much attention as there is in certain other fields where the idea of counseling and conversation is at the heart of the matter. Moreover, today, the structure of healthcare doesn't, in its financing, encourage physicians to have the opportunity to get to know their patients well. Ironically, to the extent that we want to say that we can figure out what people like by what they have chosen, if we have already intervened through various forms of choice architecture to guide their decisions towards what we generally think is the right thing for patients, we have less basis to use those prior choices as a basis for saying this is an individual's choice. And finally, the issue of publicity is going to be difficult, much more difficult than in the public setting, and it's hard to know how patients, having been told by their doctor, well, I'm using some mechanism on you, would be able to review that, although I think that someone like Dr. Diligent may be able to. So let's turn to Dr. Diligent. She recognizes her own contribution to the confused process. And she's very aware of the role of uncertainty and the difficulty that there is in conveying uncertainty to patients and still being able to have a relationship. There's a huge drive among all of us, but particularly physicians in dealing with life and death matters with patients, to have more certainty than they actually can bring to bear based upon knowledge of the field and their own knowledge in any particular setting. She is, however, willing to converse and to listen, fighting all these emphases to have very quick interactions with patients. And here's what the heart of the paper is about. She's willing to look for new sources of information, particularly small data about each patient. This is a phrase that Deborah Ester, formerly of UCLA, now at NYU, has coined to describe all the sorts of things that exist about individuals, not the big data on which big policies and generalizations are based, but all the information about us. And there are at least 3 sources for this kind of information. Some of it comes from devices that people use for self-tracking, people who wear a Fitbit, people who go online and enter information about themselves so they can see the patterns in their own life. The second one is, right now, we know a lot about all of you because I bet almost all of you have a smartphone in your pocket, and it has a GPS, and it will tell us all sorts of things. And finally, there are, using those devices and a lot of other devices, an increasing ability to have sensors and disease self-management using portable and sometimes non-portable, like sensors in the home, but ways of having something that's focused on health. The first 2 don't start off focused on health, but they have data that would be relevant to health. So obviously, there's been an incredible growth in the internet. These are the number of internet hosts since the birth of the internet, about 1982, when there were just barely 100, up to a billion such internet hosts as of 2010. Here's just a picture I love because this is Google's plant in Douglas County, Georgia. This is the central cooling plant. And we know Google has reached out in so many ways: Google Search, Google Drive, Google Chat, Google Groups, Google Earth, Google Maps, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of information, and when we interact with it, it knows about us just as it's giving us information. How many internet users per 100 inhabitants worldwide? Well, as of 2014, there are about 77 per 100 in developed countries, but even developing countries have increasing rates. Mobile phones are even more pervasive, with 97 per 100 as of 2007, maybe over 100 per 100 persons by now in developed countries. And this is just a reminder of all the different things people do with their smartphones, from using, on any average day, being on the internet about 25 minutes, playing games, taking email, texting, watching TVs and films, reading books, taking pictures. So the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. And that's what many of the technologies we're talking about are like. And of course, this is the future, well beyond any phone in your pocket. So what do these mobile technologies do? They leave a string of breadcrumbs behind them. They can contain or already have sensors sensing behavior, GPS sensing place, sound and device recognition sensing conversation, other people, and even your mood from your voice. We can have wireless data from wearable and deployable sensors. We have, of course, all the records of phone, email, and internet use. And what we're able to see is whether there's a change in pattern over time, which is obviously very important for any medical use, and increasingly real or near-time data and transfer and feedback. So what are the kinds of issues that this raises for all of us? I don't want to focus on these, but obviously on the issue side, all these technologies raise a lot of concerns for people about being tracked and monitored. They do facilitate a wide range of activities, including sharing of information, and they open up all sorts of opportunities for companies to mine the information, which is why when you go on Amazon, they tell you what you want to read, et cetera, et cetera. Now, not all data are alike. The digital technologies have changed our sense of what's private, and they shifted our expectations about what even should be private. I think some people have fear about these data. I know my kids don't. They just are out there putting everything in the world out there. I don't think they know what the word sensitive data means, but for Dr. Diligent, the issue may be then, what trade-offs should she encourage her patients to make between privacy and health uses of their data? Because a lot of the data we're talking about don't start off being health data, but Dr. Diligent is going to be the mediator between the data and its use. So there are two major things that can happen with these devices and these interfaces. One is it does provide a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, both longitudinal, how's the patient doing, how's the person doing, and a current picture. And a lot of things come out here. They can be preferences, their readiness to take actions, what is happening to the patient at that moment, and many of these devices will also provide an opportunity for personalized behavioral economics, shaping choices in light of what's happening with the patient at this very moment, very timely and fine-tuned nudges. They can be routine reminders, but they can also be two-way interactions and context-specific messages. So it's like having a doctor in your pocket. Let me give you one example, context awareness. This refers to electronic devices being able both to sense and react based on the environment. So there are body area networks that can transmit data from sensors that can be used to monitor health conditions. And these could include specific things like EKGs, oxygen saturations, accelerometers. And they've also been used with a wide variety of other health contexts, such as for diabetes, asthma, and health-related behaviors such as physical activity. This leaves us with some questions for future exploration. Let me just end with these. It's important that most of these data, is it important that they're not clinical? Can we liberate our data from the silos in which they now rest? And my sense is the answer is yes. The companies are going to be as eager to have this facilitated through special apps and algorithms that are developed because it'll make their devices more valuable. But then the question is, what will Dr. Diligent have to learn to make use of these data? How should we protect collateral participants in the process? Grandma's there, but so is her next-door neighbor. What are we picking up about the next-door neighbor who doesn't know that she's being monitored? Who should own and control these data? What health data are individuals and groups willing to share in order to get these valued goods? And what about differences in generations? So, three things that can happen, what would seem to me to make small data make behavioral economics okay in the clinical context. First, it does allow us to engage in rational persuasion because we can be more confident that we're actually getting the end that the patient wants. Secondly, we can reveal the use of behavioral nudges. For example, well, I'll leave this to the discussion, but I think that there's a good example of a situation in which a patient who doesn't want to choose can be nudged to make a choice. And finally, particular small data can customize a nudge. And let me just end with this example. Suppose you have a recovering addict, and the concern is sliding back into addiction. And you've got the smartphone set up with the GPS so that if he goes near the park where he used to go to buy his drugs, he gets a beep and it says, "Do you really want to be doing this?" And And we can use all the negative, the losses, whether or the person who has made a deal that he'll give up money, everything that behavioral economics has can be made customized for that person in a way which the big sign telling Cass Sunstein to drink water at Lollapalooza just doesn't have the same effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Our third speaker in this session will be Ester Moher, postdoctoral fellow, Electronic Health Information Lab at the University of Ottawa. So, Ester.
All right. I know you can't see me, but can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm Ester, and today I'm going to talk to you about the perilous promise of privacy. This is joint work with Khaled Emam, who is my supervisor, and my collaborator. So I'm going to take you through some problems that privacy notices or confidentiality assurances provide, how policy has kind of tried to work around that, and then I'm going to talk to you about 2 studies that show that the policy probably isn't very effective and what we might be able to do to fix that. So I also know it's Saturday morning and you might be missing your cartoons, so I tried to throw some of that in. So the problem that I'm going to be talking about today is that patients and providers are not always forthcoming for information. So patients can lie to their providers about their behavior, and providers can similarly lie about things like error rates or botched surgeries. So for example, Homer might be lying to Dr. Hibbert about the number of beers he's had this week, which is why his tummy's all like gurgly. Similarly, Dr. Hibbert might be lying to Homer by, not telling him that there was some small complication in an operation. So today I'm going to focus more on patients lying to providers, but we do have some data coming in on providers lying to patients. And so the policy prescription for this type of problem has traditionally been to provide strong assurances to increase participation rates in various medical procedures or to increase participation in research studies. And so what I mean by strong assurances, if you look at basically any health regulatory body, they have a pretty strong requirement for very explicit mentions of confidentiality practices, so how data is going to be stored, a lot of times how patients are going to be kept anonymous, that sort of thing. HIPAA, which is the American version, and PIPEDA, which is the Canadian version, basically the same thing. They actually have 7 paragraphs that are required dealing with confidentiality. That's almost a full page that patients are expected to read. CIHR, which is a Canadian funding agency that's at a national level, also requires the same thing. Privacy by design is Ontario, my province. I'm not going to go through that with you. And I sort of, more broadly speaking, any ethics board you've ever tried to get anything through has a pretty substantial requirement for at least some notice of confidentiality. So this is sort of inescapable in research today and definitely inescapable in health research. The problem, though, is that there's not really any evidence either in favor or against this, specifically looking at health disclosures. So there is some evidence in other literature that a confidentiality assurance can encourage people to feel more safe. So there's some evidence that that individuals are more likely to report behaviors when they see a confidentiality assurance in some specific situations. There's also increased response rates when a confidentiality assurance is included, so people are more likely to participate. But there's also a wealth of evidence suggesting that a confidentiality assurance alone can elicit some concern in a patient. So there are reports of decreased accuracy and consistency of reporting, so basically people lie, reduced accountability of responses. So the idea here is that if a person realizes that they're completely confidential, they also are probably realizing that there's no way for you to check whether or not they've told you the truth. Participants also report withholding more information when you provide them strong confidentiality assurances. So again, they're more likely to opt out. And there is some increased skepticism associated with confidentiality. So the idea here is that when I tell you everything you say is safe and secure, you see that as a warning instead of as a notice of decreased risk or safety. So the first research question we're going to look at is specifically testing this hypothesis with health disclosures. So the idea here is whether or not assurances help or hurt people when they're disclosing information. And Mr. Burns is looking very coy here. The methodology is pretty simple. I'm going to take you through an abbreviated version. If you have more questions about it, I can talk to you about them later, or you can read the paper. Basically, what we do is we ask participants to read a consent form, and within the consent form, we highlight anonymity information, confidentiality information, and sector information. Confidentiality information is probably the most interesting. It's the one I'm going to talk about today. But again, if you have questions, we could talk about that later. So they read a consent form. We either include confidentiality information or we don't include confidentiality information. And then we ask people to report on a variety of different health disclosure measures. So we ask them things like, have you ever had a heart attack? Have you ever had an STI? And we give them response options, so they can either fully disclose, so they say, yes, I've had this. They can give a partial disclosure, or they can say, this hasn't happened to me, a non-disclosure. And we also give them the option to opt out, so they can select an option that says they prefer not to say whether or not they've had this, this particular health issue. And so we can look at the sort of standardized, aggregated number of disclosures that people make, which is what I'm going to take you to now. So just to orient you to the graph, on the y-axis you have disclosure rates. So basically larger bars mean people have disclosed more information. Smaller or more negative bars mean people have disclosed less information. The yellow bars are the condition where participants have not been assured of confidentiality, and the red bars are where we've given people explicit confidentiality assurances. And the key section of the graph is here. So basically when participants are given a confidentiality assurance, their disclosure rate drops significantly. And this is obviously problematic because the confidentiality assurance is basically just there to encourage people to disclose more safely or to feel more safe in their disclosures. So together, this first study suggests that the presence of a confidentiality assurance discourages disclosure, even when it's very simple and embedded within the consent form. What I haven't told you so far is that the way we manipulated our confidentiality assurances wasn't just by including it in the consent form. We actually also highlighted in bold the confidentiality message so people would really see it and we knew people were paying attention. A reviewer of this thought that was a terrible move, basically because by highlighting that information, we were explicitly drawing people's attention to it, and it wasn't externally valid because that's not how things happen in the real world. The reviewer saw that as a shortcoming. We thought that was actually really interesting. So the idea here is maybe by highlighting this information, we've actually made our effect more robust. And so we thought maybe if we take that away, maybe if we find a different way to either assess how much attention people are paying to the assurance, we can get a better handle on how this affects disclosure rates. So the second study is looking at whether or not specific attention to the assurance within the consent form attenuates or increases disclosure rates. So again, the method here is pretty straightforward. We give people a consent form. Within the consent form, they're either assured of confidentiality or they're not assured. In this case, it was just regular font. We didn't put any bold. Again, we ask people to report on various health behaviors. So we ask them if they've had a heart attack. And then at the very end of the study, we give them a very simple question, asking them how much they remembered from the consent form. And we give them 4 responses, so they can respond that they vividly remember the consent form, that they just glossed through the consent form, that they didn't read the consent form, they just clicked consent, or that they have no memory for it at all. And so we're going to use this as sort of a proxy for not just attention to the consent form, but attention to the confidentiality assurance if it's present in the consent form. So again, on the y-axis, you have disclosure. So larger scores, more disclosure, smaller scores, less disclosure. And on the x-axis here, you have this subjective attention measure, so how much attention people are paying to the consent form. And we do have a significant interaction here. So basically what we're seeing is that overall, as people report paying less attention to the consent form, they actually are disclosing more information. Which is what we've seen in our previous study. But importantly, this is only happening for participants who are explicitly assured of confidentiality and isn't happening for people who are not assured at all. So basically what we're seeing here is that it's the specific assurance within the consent form that's causing this discrepancy in disclosure rates, not just the consent form in general or the idea of reading a consent form. And to further support this, you can see that there's a strong positive relationship between assurances and disclosure for consent, memory, attention, and disclosure for participants who are assured of confidentiality, but that this effect does not exist or is not significant for participants who are not assured of confidentiality. So to summarize, disclosure was negatively associated with attention, so people are less likely to disclose when they report paying more attention to the consent form, but this is moderated by the presence of an assurance. So basically when people are assured, that's when you have this ironic problem of the confidentiality assurance causing problems with disclosure. And this is sort of important because the assurance is just there to encourage people to feel more safe in their disclosing environment. So the idea here is that attention to assurances within the consent form could be triggering concern and skepticism in the patient, leading to reduced disclosure. And it does suggest that instead of seeing these assurances as a notice of safety or as a measure of decreased risk, they actually see it as a warning or as an indicator of increased risk. This obviously has a lot of policy implications within the health field and sort of beyond. The first is that researchers and policymakers and providers who are trying to do the best for their patients might not actually be doing the best. And it does suggest that previous research suggesting that disclosures are aided by confidentiality assurances might only be obtaining this effect at a cost of actual attention to the consent form. So if people aren't paying attention, they're sort of behaving in more traditional ways. And so our future work is now focused on looking at this with a real patient and provider context. So we actually just got funding to do this in Ontario with general practitioners across the province. So really looking forward to seeing whether or not this holds. We're also looking at a couple of different methods of attenuation of this effect. So whether or not we can, reframe the consent form to be more or less attractive to a participant to read in general, and whether or not that influences disclosure rates. And that's all I have for you, so thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
5 minutes for the Q&A. We can go at the end.
Oh, and we've got lots of time. Well, maybe while people are queuing up there, maybe I can start with a question for Jennifer. Jennifer, as you pointed out, one of the classic problems in affective forecasting is for patients with high spinal cord injuries that leave them paralyzed below the neck and ventilator dependent. And we know from data that right after these accidents, a great many people ask to have the ventilator withdrawn and be allowed to die. They can't imagine living in this paralyzed state. But we also know that if you can keep them on the ventilator for 6 months or a year or so, many, even most of them, will change their mind. So listening to you, I was reminded of a recent case of a young man in Indiana who fell out of a tree while hunting with a high spinal cord injury a few months ago. And within hours after the accident, his sedation was stopped. They asked him, "Do you want us to continue the ventilator?" And he said no, and they said, "Okay," and so they took it away and let him die. So, according to you, I think correctly, had they kept him on the ventilator and had he been able to have more information about what would be like in the future, he might not have made that choice. So my question for you is, do we have a right to override the autonomous rights of patients to refuse life-sustaining treatment if their affective forecasting seems to be faulty?
That's a really good question, and I think in cases like this, the physician should really kind of probe the patient to see why they have the beliefs that they do about how they'll feel in the future, to see if there are any underlying concerns for autonomy. So if it's the case that the patient is overcome by anxiety or depression or other factors that we think might impinge their autonomy, then I think in those cases we might have good reason to override patients' decisions. If it is the case that they're otherwise autonomous and competent, and it's just that they that they have a problem with trying to imagine how they will feel in the future. In those cases, I think it's a little bit less clear whether that is sufficient to override decisions. I think that's going to have to be judged on a case-by-case basis, based on factors like, how important the decision is. So in this case, the decision is very important and irreversible. So you might have more justification in cases like this. So I think you might have reason to maybe wait a little bit before honoring the patient's decision, just to give them time to process the information and give them time to actually try to imagine what life would be like in their condition. But if you give them some time and they still think, no, that's a fate worse than death, I would be miserable in that condition, then I think in those cases we probably should respect their decisions.
Okay. All right. Lots of good questions. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. Dick Daynard at Northeastern University School of Law. Also a question for Jennifer. This may be just a logical possibility. It may be a null set. But what about the converse situation where the patient is unduly optimistic, effectively, and the reality is the patient most likely will have an utterly miserable life, which most people would really just hate. And I can think certainly some end-of-life cases might make this real. Does the doctor also have an obligation to be upfront with the patient, or does the obligation of beneficence, which is on which you're basing it, suggest at that point the doctor should keep his mouth shut?
I think in cases like this, physicians should help patients develop more accurate perceptions of what life would be like under those conditions, even if it's the case that life would be much worse than the patient believes. And once the patient has a more accurate perception of what life might be like, for instance, if you can give a patient a better understanding of what it's like for people who are very sick, very frail, to undergo CPR, at the end of their lives, having a better understanding of what that's like might actually lead people to be less willing to consent to CPR. But I think they need to have that understanding and then figure out how to incorporate that with their other values. So here you're not guiding them towards a particular choice, whether to adopt for treatment or not. They're able to make that choice themselves, but those choices should be made on a realistic understanding of what that's actually going to feel like for the patient.
Thank you.
Given the number of questions, I recommend that we maybe group them in groups of two.
Sure.
Well, my question is for Jennifer also. It would seem like it would take a considerable amount of training to get it right, to be a good counselor. And this same sort of question came up with me when I worked at FDA, where people lamented physicians only get one course in nutrition, if only they knew a lot more. And the problem is, what would you recommend? Would you recommend extending medical school for this additional training, or do you think there's something that you could remove from their current training?
All right, we'll get another one here.
My question's for Esther.
Introduce yourselves too.
Sorry, Nicholson Price at the Petrie-Flom Center. So I'm just wondering about the very last point in your second study, and I'm wondering if you have a mechanism, at least maybe I'm missing something, but it seems very counterintuitive that people that didn't read or understand or remember the consent form very much were tremendously affected by what was in the consent form, and the people that read and understood it a lot were not affected. I can imagine the second thing, that people weren't affected because they read it and didn't care, but if people didn't read it, I don't see how it makes a big difference to them.
Maybe we can take even one more, looking at the line there. Thorsten?
Yeah, Thorsten Langer, Boston Children's Hospital. I've got a question for Jennifer too. This is more from a practical or clinical perspective. In these occasions, I feel oftentimes the issue is to balance grief and hope, providing hope to patients. So I was just wondering how the concept of affective forecast relates to providing hope.
Maybe we could start with Esther, and then Jennifer, you can chime in.
Hi. So the way that we set up our study, it's actually between subjects measure. So we're looking at absolute rates of disclosure in participants who either saw or didn't see the consent form. So to say that the effect had a large effect, to say the effect was large with participants who reported not reading the consent form at all, is, yeah, I guess not that intuitive, but the idea is that the effect is reduced in participants who report reading actively, and that's kind of the interesting thing. Is that sort of clear? Okay.
Okay, so I'll address the question about hope first. So I think here you have a case where you really kind of need to figure out how to balance your aims. So on the one hand, you want to help patients make good decisions and make decisions that will promote their quality of life. And you also want to help them engage in good decision making, to have true rather than false beliefs. But there are some cases where these aims kind of conflict, like cases where maybe having a less accurate perception of how things are likely to go can actually help patients improve their outcomes. And I think you have to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis, depending on how unrealistic the person's perception is, and on how much we think having the sense of hope will actually improve their outcomes. And also, if it's possible to get a sense of what the patient thinks about how much they want to hold on to their beliefs versus how much they want to know the truth. And if you can kind of probe patients to figure out sort of where they fall, then I think that can help figure out what to do in particular situations.
Dr. Capron?
Just three quick comments. On Ester's data, it doesn't surprise me at all because we have years of knowledge showing that people, when given consent forms, regard them as mostly there for the benefit of the system, not themselves. And so the more carefully they read that, the more likely they're going to have that sense. And I think if she had her slide going the other direction, where you see when you do a study like this, you can get people to disclose a lot, but the more worried they are because they've read it carefully, the less they disclose. And so it's not that the causal has to do with the non-reading, it's just the non-reading has a baseline. I don't know if it's a just rational thing or if it's a behavioral nudge, but quite a few years ago, the recommendation was we stop talking about do not resuscitate and talk about do not attempt resuscitation, DNAR, because if you were asked, if your heart stops, do you want your heart started again? Most people would say yes. If you're told, do you want to go through all these procedures and we have a 1% chance of actually succeeding, should we attempt it or not? That's a very different question. And I'll hold it at that.
Let's go back to our queue.
Stephen Marks, Harvard School of Public Health. I have a question for Alex. Full disclosure, I am wearing a Fitbit, so I am being nudged regularly. But in your conclusions, you refer to the cognitively challenged, which brings to mind Nicholas Carr's book on the internet and the brain. And I was wondering if, in the context of this small data nudging, you've considered at all the impact on the plasticity of the brain of this very technology that is so persuasive. And related to that is another equally broad question relating to your kids. As they accept this, what others might consider, other generations might consider as invasions of privacy, does this change the normal? is the normal of privacy evolving to such an extent that the definition of the right to privacy might be evolving and would have consequences for both the legal and the moral definition of privacy? So those are the two questions: plasticity of the brain impact and impact on the definition longer term of our understanding of privacy. Thanks.
Anybody else in line have a question for Dr. Capron? Maybe we could. Great, thank you.
Jed Schwartz, writer in the sociological writing. When you go to a doctor in Massachusetts at this point, there's the form you sign up, you consent to have the medical information that you that is gleaned from your interview shared with other doctors or potentially with the police on national security grounds. And it's not clear to me what happens if you don't sign this form. I don't know whether anybody's addressed this question, but in sociology there was a famous writer named Irving Goffman some decades back who wrote about total institutions and the kinds of effects that being in a total institution in which the administrators of the institution have access to virtually all information coming and going to the inmates. Typical institutions are prisons and psychiatric hospitals. And I did some work on this, extrapolating it to the Soviet Union which was around at that time. And one of the characteristics of being under this kind of surveillance that manifested itself in the Soviet Union was something called the slow schizophrenia, which was associated with large numbers of people who lived in the Soviet Union, and it was a major social problem for them. So I think that, I mean, that's contextual. I think that you know, I mean, if you sign a consent to share information and the results are positive, that is, if you know, if you feel that you're being paid attention to and that your life is improving, then the effect is likely to be.
Let's let Alex respond here, okay?
Okay, these comments are quite close together. Steve, I do think there's a lot of plasticity of the brain, and one of the issues going forward is going to be how will we think about these kinds of interventions? People who now wear diabetes monitors that monitor their glucose levels automatically and feed that information then to an insulin pump, from what I understand, don't see that as any more foreign than you think of your pancreas. I mean, it's just a mechanical substitute for the pancreas. How about other things that require some cognitive interface? Will that message that's telling you it's time to do something be seen as, well, it's being generated because I asked for it and I'm okay with it, or do I begin to feel more like an automaton? The privacy stuff, I think you already answered in the question you asked. Yes, there's a whole new normal as to what's private, and this then relates to this last question. What we're talking about here are patient-generated data. Now, some of them are person-generated. Some of them are medical, and you're being monitored, but it's a direct you. It's not a doctor doing it. Whereas the last gentleman was talking about electronic health records or otherwise that are generated by physicians. And one of the questions is going to be the interface of these things, because a lot of the stuff, my GPS and my phone is generating stuff that doesn't start off as medical, clinical information at all, but it may be very relevant, not just for the extreme drug addict case that I was giving, but just, I'm an older person, I'm at home, am I moving around as I used to? If not, should someone go and check on me because I don't seem to be as active, maybe something has happened, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these kinds of issues. And I think that question of whether it's different when we make this information available but we're generating it. It isn't mediated immediately through a physician taking notes on his or her observation and entering record information in the record.
I do see our time is out, so unfortunately I need to cut it off, but let's continue the discussion back with some coffee during our break. Thank you, everyone.